Adzul's eyes flew open. The medallion was hot on his chest. The hair on the back of his neck, and he could feel the hair on his arms go up. A sign of danger, a sign he'd experienced in battles. He didn't move. It was just before dawn, and there were wisps of fog blowing up the valley. He rolled his eyes downstream as far as he could see without moving his head, because his cloak blended perfectly with the big boulder he was lying against. He didn't see anything. He rolled his eyes far upstream as he could without moving his head. Nothing. But the medallion stayed hot. Finally, he moved his head just a little bit so he could get a further look upstream, and as he did, about 60 or 70 feet upstream, a figure stepped out to the edge of the water and kneeled down, looking upstream and then downstream. There was a sword in the right hand, and the chest was bulky. It was armor. It was a conquistador. How had they found him? 5 days after he left the trail, how had they found him? He didn't move. After a few minutes, the figure stood up and backed away out of his line of sight. He knew the valley was from the waterfall all the way to where the water came off down from the glacier was about 300 yards. That's a long ways. And there were 4 of them and 1 of him. Lots of boulders all along the edge of the stream. He thought he might have a chance. He waited, and then even above the noise of the stream, there was a clink. And a man stepped out 6 feet from his head and walked to the edge of the water and looked up and down and stood there for several minutes. Adzul didn't dare move a muscle. He slitted his eyes shut so he could just see the man's boots. He didn't want any eye contact. He didn't want to stare at his head to create any eye contact that might spot him. And after a few minutes, the man turned around and walked back past the boulder and out of sight. Adzul waited for several minutes, figuring that these guys would now move upstream looking for him, and he'd have a chance. He stood up very, very slowly, loaded his sling, and stepped away from the boulder, looking upstream. All of a sudden, he felt a presence behind him, and he started to whirl, but he was too late. The conquistador, who'd been standing on the other side of his boulder, crashed the butt of his sword handle down on Adzul's head, driving him to the ground, almost senseless. The conquistador screamed for the other conquistadors, and they came running. The first man raised his sword and was about to thrust it through Adzul's body when one of the others yelled at him, "No, don't do that, don't kill him. We need to take him back to the captain. The captain promised gold. The captain wants to kill him in his own torturing way. We want to get the gold." And so the rest of them resorted to kicking and beating him until he was long unconscious. When Adzul opened his eyes, he was tied up pretty cruelly. There was a rope around his neck, attached to his wrists, and then running behind his knees, drawing his knees up and his head down, so he was really in kind of a fetal position, very tight, couldn't move. Every part of his body hurt from the beating he'd had, although the armor vest had protected him probably from getting broken ribs. His cloak was gone, the tunic was still on, and under it, the armor shirt. It was probably midday, and the 4 conquistadors were sprawled out on the ground, sound asleep. They had come to the river about midnight and spent all that time looking for him until they found him just before dawn. And they were exhausted by the time they got him tied up. So they lay down, they just sprawled out on the ground and went to sleep. He was wondering what he could do when one of the figures rose up and walked over to him and inspected the ropes tying him. Adzul couldn't move. He was on his side, lying on his side completely, well, in a fetal position, completely tied. And as the conquistador bent over him, he saw the leather strap around Adzul's neck and grabbed it and pulled out the medallion. And he said to himself, he looked quickly at the others who were still asleep. He said to himself, a little extra treasure for me in case the captain doesn't give us all the gold he promised. And he said, we'll just take this silver medallion because it was pure silver. And he pulled on the strap, but the strap wouldn't break. So with his right hand, he reached to a knife in his belt, pulled it out, and with his left hand, he grabbed the medallion itself, thinking he would cut the strap with his knife. The instant his left hand closed over the medallion, it began burning into his skin, through the tendons in his hand, into the tendons in his hand. It was like a burning hot ember right out of the fire. And he groaned. He didn't dare yell out because if the others found out he tried to steal treasure from them, they'd have killed him. So he groaned and gritted his teeth, and it kept burning into his left hand. And finally, he grabbed the strap in his right hand and yanked the medallion away from his left hand, turned around and stumbled over to the stream and put his left hand down into that ice cold water. It was just, his hand was burned. Wherever the medallion had touched it, it was burned black, flesh and bone showing in the hand. Well, as he wrenched his hand out of the medallion fell onto the rope attaching Adzul's neck to his hands. And in an instant, it burned through the rope. And Adzul got his fingers, his hands were still tied, but he reached his fingers and hunched himself around until he could grab the medallion with his fingers and touch the rope tying his hands, and it burned through instantly. And then the rope tying, going behind his legs, behind his knees, burned through it instantly. He noticed, even in this stress, he noticed that while the medallion was burning through these ropes, instantly burning through him, it was cool to his hand. So he stood up, slipped the medallion back over his head, and bent down to grab his sling, which was lying on the ground right where he'd been beaten. His cloak was gone. He had his tunic and armor vest. And as he moved to get the sling, the conquistador whirled around from the stream and yelled. And in an instant, the other 3 conquistadors were up swords out, rushing at him from very, very close, 10, 15 feet away. Adzul had no choice. He took 3 steps and jumped into the river. It swept him away. As he was going towards the waterfall, he managed to wrap the sling tightly around his left wrist. He didn't want to lose the sling. And in a minute or so, he went over the waterfall. Now, the waterfall was 120 feet. That's 12 stories. The next time you're in a big building, go up 12 stories and go to a window and look down at the street. That's how far he fell. As he went over, he was flailing around, and he knew that he didn't dare have his head hit or his body hit sideways, because it would be like falling on solid rock when he hit the water. Just before he landed in the pool, he got himself organized feet first and plunged down into the pool all the way almost to the bottom. It was a deep, deep bottom. Struggled his way to the surface, and he knew from having looked at over the waterfall the day before, he knew that the pool had a strong current that went right to rapids rushing down the hillside. And sure enough, he started getting swept toward the rapids. And he was a swimmer. He knew how to swim. So he stroked and kicked towards the side, but his left foot wasn't working well, and he didn't have a whole lot of kick. And his hands got to be within about 8-10 feet of the side. Couldn't make it. He was being swept into the rapids. Just before he hit the rapids, his right leg dragged over a boulder under the water that was close to the surface. With all his strength, he got his right foot, onto the boulder and pushed, and his hands reached the shore. And he grabbed some rocks, and his body was swung around downstream, but he held on until he could inch himself up out of the pool and onto a big, flat rock by the side of the pool. He rolled over on his back. It was midday. Sun was up, but it was cold. He rolled over onto his back, gasping, and he looked back up the waterfall. 4 faces were bent over the side of the river, at the side of the waterfall, and he could see the mouths yelling at him. He couldn't hear anything because of the noise of the waterfall and so on. He could see them, and all he had time to do was just very feebly wave one hand, and he passed out. A sharp, sharp pain in his left leg and another one in his right leg brought him almost sitting upright several hours later. As he moved to sit up, 2 huge birds flapped away through the air, vultures. He had been lying there for hours, and they had thought he was dead. And they landed. Fortunately, one arm, his right arm, had been thrown across his face, covering his eyes. Otherwise, they would have gone for his eyes first. As it was, one was pecking at his left thigh, the other at the wound on his right thigh. Well, they took off, and he sat up. His body, except for where the armor shirt was, his body was just, he'd been beaten and beaten. His head and neck and his legs and thighs, they'd beaten him and kicked him, and he was sore in his middle of his body, but not as sore. Raging thirst. He dragged himself over. His left ankle wasn't working right, and he dragged himself over to the water and got a big drink and then examined his ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was hugely swollen. Somehow he'd sprained his ankle hitting the pool with the waterfall. found himself desperately hungry. He hadn't had any chinchillas for a couple of days. And so he started turning over rocks along the edge of the pool and along the edge of the water. And sure enough, under rocks, he found worms and grubs and insects, and he ate them. He picked them up in his fingers and ate them. They were food. And he probably got about, from the rocks around the edge of the pool, dragging himself around, he probably got about 3 handfuls of grubs and worms and larvae and all kinds of stuff from under the rocks. And you know, it sounds gross, but when you're starving to death, it doesn't matter. And it gave him energy. By now it was halfway through the afternoon or so, and he sort of hobbled and dragged himself from the edge of the pool over to the slope. Now the slope down was probably over 50 degrees. That's extremely steep. You can barely walk on a 45-degree slope. Way miles and miles below him was the big green carpet that he knew was safety. So he got his tunic around him, and he lay down on his back and started sliding down the rock and dirt slope. There was very little grass, just dirt and rocks, and it was extremely painful. He'd crash, he'd get going pretty fast, sliding on his back, head uphill, trying to control himself with his arms, and he'd crash into boulders, and it just would stun him really badly. And but he had to keep going down. Survival was driving him. He had to keep going down. And he crashed around and banged around, and finally it started to get dark. And he knew he couldn't keep sliding, so he dragged himself over to the river. He kept the river to his right, dragged himself over the river, got, again, as much as he could drink, because he knew the water was really important for him. And, you know, maybe 2 handfuls of grubs and insects and from under the rocks, and then it was dark. So he had marked a nearby boulder, and he crawled over to it and got up on his feet. His left ankle just killed him. And the first thing he did was he leaned both hands against the boulder and he started raising his legs one after the other to his chest. One after the other, one after the other. He knew the temperature would be far below freezing that night. And he knew the only thing he could do was keep blood circulating in his body or he'd freeze to death. So he raised one leg after the other, one leg after the other, one leg after the other. When he felt he had circulation going in his legs, he stood up on his feet and started windmilling his arms and beating his arms on his chest, back and forth, until his arms had circulation. And then he'd go back to working on the legs, and he became desperately tired. He wanted nothing more than to lie down and go to sleep. At the same time, he knew that was a death sentence. So he kept going all night. He was almost delirious by the morning. He hadn't had, just those grubs. He did have had plenty of water, but he was just beat, and it was well below freezing. As soon as it was light enough, he went over to the river and bent down, kneeled down, and got a big long drink. And as he lifted his head from the water, his eyes caught something peculiar downstream, about 70 yards, something very odd. And then he knew what it was. He pushed himself back, got on the slope, and judging as best he could, pushed himself. He didn't have to push much, and got hurtling down the slope until he crashed into a rock and stopped and guessed about the right distance, about 70 yards, and then he dragged himself and crawled over to the river. And there, on top of a rock, just a little bit downstream, was his cloak. He guessed that the conquistadors must have pulled it off him to better kick him and beat him, thrown it into the river, and it had caught on this rock at the edge of the river, whatever it would have been, probably a quarter of a mile, half a mile down from the waterfall and the pool. So he inched himself across some rocks, grabbed it, pulled it off the rock, and got back up and started wringing it out. Now, you know, the material was wool. And so he wrung it out. It was still damp by the time he got done. He spent an hour just sitting there, wringing out every drop of water he could. It was still damp. But in case you don't know, wool, even wet, provides warmth. And as soon as he got it as damp as dry as he could, he wrapped it around himself. And within a minute or two, it started feeding warmth back into his body. But he couldn't stop. So he knew that the rocks and dirt would trash his cloak, and he had felt around on his tunic, and it was pretty well trashed from the day before. So he took his stuff off. Cloak, well, hadn't put the cloak on. He took his tunic off, took the armor vest off, then put the tunic on, put the cloak on, and then got the armor vest over the top of the cloak and tied everything around his waist with his sling. And he went over to the slope and started down. And he'd just get out of control, going down on the dirt and rocks. One time he went off a 15-foot cliff, and it knocked him out for he didn't know how long when he hit the ground, ran up against another boulder. Got himself going again all that day down. Probably made maybe a mile, maybe a little bit more than a mile down the slope, and he was beat from the crashing into rocks. He was beat beyond belief, but he kept going. And night came, dragged himself over to the stream. There weren't many grubs under the rocks this time. Drank as much as he could, and then curled up and got his cloak completely around him and went to sleep. It snowed 8 inches that night. When he woke up, there was 8 inches of snow on top of him. Now, snow is an insulator, so it did help the cloak keep him warm. But he pushed up out of it, and it was snowing heavily. So he dragged himself to the river. Wasn't frozen because it was too steep and rushing. So he got himself some water and got out on the snow and started sliding. Now, the snow was much softer than the rock and dirt, and he slid much better, feet down, head up, and was able to kind of guide himself. He got going pretty darn fast. About the middle of the day, it was still snowing hard. About the middle of the day, in the snow, the snow all around him, he went off a 30-foot cliff into a huge snowdrift below it. Took him 40 minutes to dig himself out of the snowdrift. But he kept going all that day in the snow, and by the time it started to get dark, the snow was easing up. Got himself a drink. His hands were too cold from flailing out and guiding himself in the snow, curled up in his cloak and went to sleep. And that night it froze hard. And on the next morning, when he woke up, got up, and he felt the snow, and it was frozen on top. He checked his armor vest, and for all the sliding and everything else, the armor vest, it was so strong, hadn't taken any damage at all. So he got on the frozen snow and made himself stiff and kept his arms out to the side, and he flew. He flew down on the frozen snow for at least half the day until the sun warmed it and it started to get sloppy. He covered miles going down that morning, just hurtling down. And he now was pretty good. He could see the boulders sticking up out of the snow, and he could use his arms to kind of guide himself around them, so he didn't have too many crashes. And he covered miles until midday, maybe 1 o'clock. The snow got too soft. So he got up and stumbled and snowed, because it got really soft, and he stumbled along about knee deep in the snow for the rest of the day. Found some grubs that night, got a big drink, froze again the next morning, and for the first couple hours the next morning, he hurtled on hard snow. And finally, about noon, the snow softened, and he stopped sliding and stood up. His ankle was better. It was still hugely swollen, but it was better. The snow was ankle, maybe a little bit more than ankle deep. And he trudged down all afternoon. And by the time it started to get dark, he was out of the snow. The air was cool, but it was not brutally cold. There were some bushes and trees starting to appear on the hillside, and it was flattening. The hillside was flattening. It had flattened enough for him to be able to walk without falling down. He was out of the high mountains. 2 days later, Adzul stumbled into the jungle. There were huge dark circles under his eyes. You could count every rib in his chest. When he got to the jungle, he no longer needed his cloak because it was warm. And his feet were cut and bruised, but he was alive. And he was still by the side of the river. He got into the tall trees, slumped down as darkness came on, got a big drink out of the river. He was too exhausted to even get grubs. He found a big tree and leaned against it, sat and leaned against it, and in an instant, he was sound asleep. Hours later, the most unbelievable roar woke him up. And he shot up to his feet with his back against the tree, eyes looking everywhere for the source of the danger. And that is the end of episode 3. Now, those of you who know the story figure out an ending or what happens next in the story, not using my ending. Those of you who don't know the story, try to write an example of what you think happens next, and we'll pick up the story tomorrow. Now remember, um, what I'm telling is the ancestor side of the Medallion series. There's a whole other part of the story going on, as those of you who have read the books know, a modern side of the story going on along with the ancient side of the story. I'm only telling the ancient side. So those of you who haven't read the books, there's a whole different, there's half of the whole story takes place in modern times. Half is the ancient times, which I'm telling now. So have fun with it.